Hi, today I'm going to show you how easy it is to make your own citrus curd at home. It takes about 10 minutes. It's something I've been making since I was tiny, and I now make it with my 6-year-old, so it's a great thing to make during the holidays with kids. It's also an easy thing to knock up if you've got people coming over and you want something impressive to put out for brunch or for dinner. I'm going to make it today with grapefruit. You can make it with lemon as well, and I'll talk you through how to change those different citrus around. So first things first, you want to use some scales. I'm going to give you the measurements in ounces and grams. You want to put your pan on the scales. If you've got digital scales, that makes everything a lot easier. When you put your pan on top of the scales, zero it out, and that way the pan doesn't recognise the weight. Sorry, the scales don't recognise the weight of the pan. First things first, we're going to put some butter in. I'm using salted butter. A lot of baking recipes tell you to use unsalted butter, but actually you need some salt with sugar, otherwise everything just tastes too sweet. So just buy a nice salted butter. And we're going to use 115 grams, which is 4 ounces. And if you're in America, that's about half a stick. So that's 67. Nearly there. This is a really good way of getting kids using their numbers as well. If you get them to tell you if you need to put more or less in when they look at the numbers. Perfect. So we've got our butter in. Now we're going to put some sugar in. I've cut the sugar down quite a lot, but you need about 140 grams. So again, just zero it out. And I'm going to put 140 grams in, which is 5 ounces. Now I'm using, oops, a bit too much, but that's fine. You'll see this is not quite as white as a lot of sugar. This is unbleached sugar because there's absolutely no need to bleach sugar. One less chemical in there. And then the important thing, so we're going to put citrus in. Now these are grapefruits. If you're making this with these quantities, you want to use the zest of 2 grapefruits and the juice of 1. The zest has all the flavour in it. So when you're zesting, you basically, can you see I'm like zesting and turning? I'm not doing this, because when you do that you get all the pith and that's really bitter. So the reason I use so much zest is, basically if you want to get all the flavour of citrus, if you put a lot of juice in there, you're going to make whatever you're making very liquid, whereas the zest doesn't really affect the texture of it, but it has tons and tons of flavour. So whenever you're cooking, apart from this recipe, anything really, if a recipe tells you to put zest or juice in, always put extra zest. So that's 1. Here's the next one. Now, if your citrus is waxed, and most of the stuff you buy at the supermarket will be, just pop it into a bowl of hot water for about 5 minutes, and the wax will just melt off. And if you're lucky enough to live in California like we used to, or anywhere else that grows citrus, you can just pop out into the back garden and pick it off the tree, which is still pretty amazing. And then you don't need to take the wax off, obviously. The reason wax gets put on things is to make it look shiny, but also just to protect it from drying out. So that's pretty much all of it. Now this is a microplane zester, so that's what it's going to look like. So the microplane zester just gets, it smells amazing, just gets all the zest off really nicely, and you can buy that through my shop. So we've got sugar, butter, zest. I'm going to put the juice in, and remember I'm only putting the juice of 1 of the grapefruits in. If you were doing lemon, you'd do the juice and zest of 2 lemons. This gorgeous pink grapefruit. I'm going to juice it. So this, I think a lot of people are used to having citrus curd just on toast instead of jam. But I actually did a really lovely dessert with this, where I did ice cream, the curd, and then shortbread. So it's really yummy. So don't just put it on toast, put it on all sorts of things. We have it on pancakes. It's gorgeous served into yogurt, on porridge. It's also a really nice thing to take if you're going to stay with people for the weekend. Just buy some nice bread and take a jar of this. And I think you're very fancy. So that's all gone. Everything's in there, ready to go. Now we can move over to the heat. Now I like to start this off on quite a high heat. And I'm using a whisk. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to melt the butter and melt the sugar. And if you've got it on a high heat, that'll happen pretty quickly. However, if you are using a high heat, you really need to be next to it and concentrating. If you're not as confident, just drop the heat a bit. I always tell people who come to my cooking classes, if you're not a confident cook, the lower the heat, the more control you've got, within reason. The higher the heat, things will cook faster, but they're also going to burn faster, so you just need to be a bit more careful with them. So already this is starting to dissolve. While that dissolves, I'm just going to crack some eggs into a bowl. With 2 eggs. Oops. And this is what's going to help thicken our curd. So it's a little bit like a custard, and we'll have a look back over here. See? It's all starting. Leave that again for a sec. I'm just going to whisk these eggs up with the same whisk. I'm using large eggs, always organic and free range, because it's a bit sad not to. So that's whisked. So set the eggs aside. We're not going to use those just yet. We'll come back over to the pan, and you can see this is really starting to melt. If you're doing this with children, of course, at this stage, remind to tell them to hold the pan right at the end and not touch the hot bits. Nearly there. So if you've got any little bits of the grapefruit, or if you're using lemon in there, don't worry about it. You can either sieve it out if it's really important for you that it's smooth, or just leave them in. So here we go, everything's melted, starting to bubble a little bit. So we're going to take that off the heat. Now this is a bit of an important scientific bit. If we were to put these eggs straight into there now, they basically turn into lemony, grapefruity scrambled eggs. So what we do is we do something called tempering, and tempering comes from temperature. And what it means is you have cold eggs, hot mixture. So if you put the cold eggs in there, it would scramble like we said. So what we do to kind of like make them more on the same level is put a little bit of the hot mixture into the egg while we're whisking it. Not too much. And then what happens is, this has become a bit warmer, but not too dramatically so. And then what we do, again, this bit's really important, you do this off the heat and whisk constantly. You pour the egg in, whisk, and straight away, the heat of the butter and sugar and grapefruit mixture is going to start thickening up the proteins in the egg and cooking them. If you don't whisk, you're going to get a scrambled egg. But if you do whisk, I'm going to put the heat back on like a medium-high heat. What will happen is the egg starts to cook, but it keeps nice and smooth and silky, and the whisking stops those lumps forming. So it's basically like making scrambled egg. I know I keep having on about scrambled egg. So this is going to take about 2 minutes. While I do that, I'm going to keep whisking, and then soon I'll show you how the texture. So see now it's still very liquid. I'm going to talk to you about how you store this. So this isn't like jam or pickle or chutney or marmalade. It's not going to keep in a cupboard for 6 months. It's only going to keep in the fridge. You still want to have a nice clean jar. So an empty jam jar, just pop it in the dishwasher or pop it in boiling water for a couple of minutes, just to make sure it's nice and clean. And then you're going to, once this is ready, you'll pour it into your jar and keep it in the fridge. And it will keep in the fridge, I believe, for up to 5 days. It's never lasted that long in our house. But then after 5 days, because it's got the eggs in, you probably want to get rid of it. So this is starting to thicken up. Nearly there. Can you see? It's almost like a custard, like a lemony, grapefruity custard. There we go. So right now it's going to get thick because the egg is cooking. However, remember it's got butter in there. Because the butter's still hot and melted, it's still quite liquid. When you put it in the fridge, that butter will set up again, and that's what's going to give you a much thicker curd. So we're nearly there. If at any point you feel like you're starting to see big lumps of egg, take it off the heat, because that just means it's cooking a bit too fast. But we're done. That's it. Now I can tell it's done because I've made this loads of times, but for a little test, what you can do is grab a spatula. I love these silicone spatulas. Give it a stir, and then basically draw your finger down, and if the curd doesn't go back together again, you know it's thickened up enough. And it also means you get to lick your finger to taste it, which is delicious. Now remember I talked about the salted butter being important. The way your mouth works, if you're eating something very sweet, it's kind of balanced very far in the sweet direction. If you put a bit of salt in it, it just balances everything out, which sounds a bit strange, but it's the reason salted caramel, salted chocolate, all that stuff is so popular. Putting in a little pinch of sea salt, this is Maldon sea salt, just stops it being too sweet. And some people say, well, why don't you just put less sugar in? But you kind of need that amount of sugar for the curd to work, so we're counteracting the sugar. And that's it. So all I'm going to do now is pour it into my jar. And like I say, it's still very liquid. But once it's been in the fridge for a while, it's going to set up. Beautiful. Pop a lid on. It will go in the fridge and set. And then you'll have it ready for breakfast or brunch, or to give people. This little pot's going away with us because we're going away for the weekend. But I'm going to put the recipe on my site. You can buy all the equipment on my site. There's tons of other recipes on there as well. And drop me an email or send me a message if you've got any questions. Good luck with it.